It was frozen this morning. You ready? All right. So I'm start all over again. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and I would like you to welcome Jane Harper for her first visit to the place of business. Jane has come to us from Melbourne, Australia. Now, for any of you who may have grown up in the Midwest, Melbourne is not dissimilar to the northern suburbs of Chicago. I find it, Evanston was a kind of a nice analogy, and one of the reasons I love Melbourne, aside from the university and its unbelievably good city library, one of the best city libraries I've ever been to, is your botanical garden. I'm really struck with the begonias, right? Just to prove I've really been there. So a question for you, the reason I brought it up, Jane, would be, living in Melbourne, which is down towards the southern end of Australia, what's drawn you so often to Queensland and the outback?
So thank you for coming, by the way. It's really lovely to be here. So I live in Melbourne, which is, as you said, a sort of city. It's coastal. It's very urban, obviously. But I think for me, the settings are such an important part of the book, and there's a few reasons why I tend to go for the more kind of remote, isolated settings. And one is I think they're just a real gift for Australian writers. They're really diverse. In our country, we've got a lot of this kind of mix of like beauty, brutality. Things can go wrong very quickly. So it kind of gives you that sort of a really great sort of backdrop for books with a bit of a mystery and suspense element. For this latest book, The Lost Man, I went to all the way to sort of outback Queensland, which for those of you who I'm not sure how familiar with the geography, but it's in the sort of northeast but very central. So it's what we call the interior, and that's like real sort of full on outback where it gets to well over like I looked up like 105 degrees plus like regularly sort of every day. It's very isolated, and it's a really sort of brutal landscape, but people live out there and they make their livelihoods out there, and I think I just became really interested in those kind of communities where they're so isolated, but they, and it impacts every aspect of their lives, and that's kind of how I started to come up with the idea for the book.
Of course, when you say 105 in other venues, people probably go, oh, in Phoenix we're going.
Yeah, that's okay.
It's a reasonable summer day. But we are familiar, with what the environment can do to people. There are people who die here of dehydration and other things on a fairly regular basis because they don't look. It's even more deceptive here because it looks like a city, and it's really dangerous. At least the outback that you're writing about, especially in this new book, it isn't a city. It's very sparsely populated.
That's it. Yeah, actually, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think the thing that really struck me when I went out there for my research was quite how how sort of well prepared people are. The locals, at least. I mean, the tourists not so much. I mean, it seems like they have tourists who go out there and do all kinds of stupid things, but the locals certainly were so well prepared, and they, there's sort of reference in the book, but you open up the back of their cars and they have have sort of weeks worth of supplies, and have litres of water and food and a shovel and first aid kits and all this kind of thing, so they can sort of survive in this really harsh climate. But it's often the tourists who get in trouble, because I think much like you said people underestimate how dangerous the heat can be in a city, but I think tourists are so used to being in a close to help that they really don't realise how isolated they can actually be in Australia.
So in your first book, The Dry, which I thought had, the main core, we're not going to do any spoilers here, but the main core of the murder.
Can you bring the sound up?
Can't hear you.
You can't hear us? Patrick? Hold on. Is that better?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry. You can watch it later on on the video. You'll be able to get it. But thank you for letting us know. In The Dry, which obviously takes its title from the fact that the area you're writing about has been so stricken with drought, how ironic that one person in it dies in water. I thought, aside from the main crime, it was really very interesting that somebody drowns in a book called The Dry.
Yeah, and I think, is that better? That sounds better. I think, one of the things I really was trying to sort of pull out in The Dry was the fact that these communities that are suffering from really extreme droughts and really struggling with them weren't always like that. And people used to have thriving farms and businesses that ran well based on the land and the weather patterns, and a lot of that has disappeared, and they just haven't got the the ability to reinvent the industry. So there's a lot of people who really don't know what else to do. But I think it was kind of that contrast that I was trying to capture, really, that you go back just not that many years at all, and the towns were very different then.
As a reporter, because you had I think I have this right, a career as a journalist now, what are your plots inspired by things that you've written about or happened, that you've come across as a journalist?
So yeah, I was a journalist. So I was a journalist for 13 years, and I worked on 2 newspapers in the UK and also 2 in Australia, and I covered all kinds of things during that time. So I did a little bit of crime, but I did like loads of other stuff as well, like health and community things and education and all kinds of different different topics. And I think for me, I mean, that journalism helped me like in a lot of ways, and I think so I've never used any specific event that I've covered. I've never sort of tapped into any sort of one actual story, because I think it's really unfair to use real people and real events unless you're going to completely sort of be upfront about that. But I think for me, what I've tapped into a lot more has been more the like the emotional aspect. So when you go out and speak to someone who's had something's happened, and it could be very traumatic, or it could seemingly be very minor, but in some way it affects them, and trying to kind of listen to their story and how it affects them and the community, and then trying to tell that in a way that people who aren't directly affected can relate to. I think that's the kind of skill that I found really useful in fiction, trying to kind of capture those sort of emotional, psychological impacts, and then relate them in a way that people can recognise them.
Well, certainly in The Dry, a whole dynamic of the community has a huge amount to do with how the story plays out. You'd like to think that, well, as readers, I've always felt that the best books are the ones where you can root for the hero and really mourn the victims. You should feel loss or some kind of when people die. One of the crimes in The Dry, you'd like to think that when people are killed, it's for a big reason, and yet one of the crimes in The Dry I thought was so interesting because it wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think with all the books and all the kind of I guess the stories and the way they play out, I think for me I always try and think of tapping into kind of the authenticity and making scenarios believable, and a big part of that is kind of, I guess, looking at how mundane life can be often, and how people can make difficult decisions and do really things that maybe they otherwise would never dream of doing for certain reasons, which often are not they're not dramatic, and they're not sort of James Bond type situations. They're just normal people who've been pushed to a point of desperation and have been forced to act, and I sort of feel that's a line that a lot of us, thank goodness, never get pushed to, but it's it's potential for everybody, really, depending on their situation and their lifestyle.
I thought it raised the impact of the crime, the fact that it was, as you point out, an ordinary person pushed to an extreme. I had this discussion with, trying to think, Joe Finder last week, who has a protagonist who has put herself in a bad place. She's had a one-night stand that comes back to haunt her. And the challenge then was to make readers really interested in or sympathetic with her as her dilemma then progresses, because she put herself in that position in the first place. And so how can you make her really sympathetic to readers?
Yeah, and I think a big part of, although the books, they sort of tend to get classified as crime or mystery novels, but for me it's always the crimes that that the books kind of, I guess, usually open with for me they're always more just like the catalyst to tell the story. So it's never really about the crime for me. It's always about the characters, and I think that's what I'm really interested in, and why people behave in certain ways, and what sort of factors come into play to shape them into the people they've become. And I think, that's sort of been true for all the books. I think for the third one in particular, that really became, very clear to me, just in sort of thinking about people and they're living in such an extreme and isolated location, and they all sort of react to things in very different ways depending on, certain things in their background. And it was a really interesting sort of character study for me as writing it, thinking about how people would, believably and authentically react, so that hopefully the characters do feel, recognisable and real.
So in your new book, landscape actually turns out to be the murder weapon. So can you tell us about the stockman? This all happens right at the beginning, so no spoilers. About the stockman's grave, and then how the person dies in its vicinity.
Yeah, so in the Lost Man, it opens up in the prologue. So it is sort of the first pages. We open up with the death of a man, and he is found in the middle of nowhere on this really isolated cattle property, and he's the middle one of three brothers who've all grown up, so they're all outback men through and through. They know what they're doing out there. They've got the cars, full of supplies. They know what the weather's like, and they know how to survive and thrive in that environment. But this particular man is found dead miles from his home and from his car, and he's found dead on at one of the few man-made landmarks in the whole area, which is this Stockman's grave, which is not actually a real. It's not a real landmark, but it's based on. It's actually based on real things that I discovered during my research. So Stockman's grave itself is not real, but that concept of in the outback they have these quite unusual sort of instances where someone has died, in the middle of nowhere, and if they're lucky, someone's come along later and put up a bit of a memorial to them. So you can just be in the middle of the desert and you see these really incredibly ornate graves just standing all alone, which I thought was a really striking visual opportunities, and I couldn't sort of resist putting it in the book. So so we open up with this this man found at this sort of single man-made landmark in the middle of nowhere.
But what's really horrifying is that it's clear that he's been circling around it. You can see it, you can read it in the land, and he's desperately trying to find shade, because there he is under this, incredible sun without anything to protect him. And so you can see that he tried the best he could, right, to stay in shade.
And I think that was something that really struck me when I was out there. And I'm sure actually that's something that probably is familiar to a lot of people in this area as well, when you can feel that kind of that burning sort of heat, and you're just sort of seeking out that, you're standing in the sort of corner of, a tiny little bit of shade thrown by, like a tiny tree, and I think it's that sort of instinct is something that I think a lot of you guys here would recognise.
Absolutely. Well, not just us. Remember, Mad Dogs and Englishmen were out in the noonday sun. I mean, I remember being on the island of Delos near Mykonos, and because, those old cities were built out of marble, including the floor as well as, and it was 125. And we were all desperate, trying to find any little place where we could kind of get out of the sun. And the tour guide sort of casually said that, well, in the summer, he said, people just drop like flies. We take them out. And I thought, okay, but where are the umbrellas? Because, at least if you have a little shade, you have a shot at surviving. But if you are right there in the full glare of the sun and you can't get away, how long did it take your guy to die?
Yeah, that was actually one of the interesting things when I went out there. So for this book, actually, what I did, I approached the writing process slightly differently than I had before. So for all the books, I'd always planned and I'd always sort of known where I wanted the story to go, and I'd known the ending, and I'd known a few pieces along the way. But this time I completely sort of separated out the writing and the planning process. So I just spent quite a few months planning and researching and drawing up a bit of a map as to what I wanted to happen. And then I went out to do sort of the on-the-ground research. So when I went out there, I already had quite a strong idea of what I wanted to happen, and it involved, the heat and the exposure and this lack of shade. But I remember thinking, gosh, I hope I haven't kind of overdone this. Maybe I've sort of slightly exaggerated the sort of the dangers here, but I could probably get away with it. I can probably sort of make it work. And then when I went out there and I was speaking to people, or even just being out myself, the most interesting was how I completely underestimated how dangerous it really is, and
That's right.
and in terms of the length of time people survive. I mean, we're talking, if you're unlucky, I mean, it could be hours. We're not even talking a full day really. And young healthy guys, and there's all these sort of terrible stories about young guys in their 20s who are sort of just a few kilometres from home, and they can walk there, and they get disoriented, and then they start walking back, and they just get completely lost, and they get found. Really, if they just stayed with their vehicle and waited for help. And there's so many stories like that of tourists, and so I think that sort of surprised me a little bit.
It's not just that climate. I took my younger daughter to Peru for her 50th birthday, and we're frisking about up in the northern part of Peru, and we're like 12,000 feet or something of the sort, and I take whatever those pills are that, help your corpuscles. I can't remember what they're called at the moment, so I'm fine in Peru, skipping around on mountains. But right up above us, there was this kind of funny tent, and the guide said casually that these two Japanese hikers had come, and they were fine, they were young, they were healthy, it was all good. And they went up there and got into their tent, and they were both dead by morning. Because, their lungs, it's the thing that happens to you at Everest or something, but it can happen to you at a much lower level. But the point is, it's not an age-related thing. Young people, strong people can die in extreme situations like that. It doesn't have to be old and weak people.
No, and I think again that's a sort of somewhere a lot of tourists fall foul of that when they think exactly I'm young, I've got my mobile phone, which they sort of don't really appreciate doesn't work out there, and you hear stories about people trying to sort of walk to nearest town with a litre of water, and I mean it takes you need a litre every half hour out there really. It's but I mean that was sort of but then at the same time you've got people who have lived there their whole lives, and they don't know any difference, and they absolutely cope and survive, and have these businesses, and they it's their home and they love it, and they absolutely know how to handle themselves.
Where is the town called Alice? Where in Australia is it? I was thinking about the movie when all this was going on.
Oh, so Alice Springs, I think that'll be
Alice Springs, is that what it is? Where is it?
So that's very sort of central, so like middle north, but kind of in the centre as well.
And also, I think of Queensland as like crocodiles and jungle, and well, I do. And I was really interested at the size that Queensland must be for you to have, would you say they were like 500 miles west of Brisbane? For your locale in this book?
I mean, Queensland is huge. I mean, it is the biggest state, and it has it's very diverse. I mean, it has the whole coastal area as well. But the town in the book is fictional, but it's sort of geographically based on the town where I went to do my research, which was to get there I had to fly to Brisbane, and then from Brisbane I flew to a town called Charleville, which is about 500 kilometres west. And then from there I met a retired police officer who was this fascinating man who had lived in Birdsville, which was this tiny outback town, for 10 years. And he single-handedly policed an area the size of England all on his own. So that was his job for a decade. So he was an amazing resource, as you can imagine. And I met him, and he very kindly offered to drive me. And we went on this sort of bizarre sort of epic road trip where we drove 11 hours. And we drove 900 kilometres, which is about 600 miles, across like this sort of desert outback. We saw in the 11 hours, we saw 15 cars in the entire time, and some of them were travelling in convoy as well. So, and he just told me his stories and answered my questions, and then, and then we hit Birdsville, which is right on. It's actually kind of on so it's sort of close to 3 states. So even then, he was like one of the only officers in Australia who was sworn in like several states because he had to cross the border, and it was just an incredible kind of work that he did. But it was a great resource because he answered all my questions, and I was supporting all these scenarios to him. What happens in this situation? And he introduced me to people like the Aboriginal elders and the nurse who drives the ambulance, which is again like kind of the only sort of medical facility within any kind of reach. So it was it was a really fascinating trip.
So you're finding that doing this is bringing you a greater knowledge of your own country.
Yeah, I think it definitely is, and I think the kind of area that the book is set in is something that I think like a lot of Australians are very familiar with. Like we do we are very aware of it. But in terms of actually getting out there, like it was such like trek, honestly. Like I had to it took me ages to even get there, and then when you're out there, you're kind of stuck there because there's only like a plane like once a week, and you have to. There's nowhere really to, very sort of limited accommodation and things. So it's a trip that not a lot of Australians actually get to make. It's something that I was quite fortunate to actually go out and get to see it and hopefully sort of capture it in a way that sort of kind of brings it to life.
Yeah, I mean, I can easily imagine that you would never have gone there if you had wanted to write this book, right? You might have.
No, absolutely, yeah. And I think a lot of people that's why I guess it's great, being. Because I'm a full-time author now, and I think one of the things that's really struck me, for anybody who might be writing their own book, like I've been really, quite, impressed by how willing people are to help authors, and I've always I knew that as a journalist, that it was, I had that sort of habit of picking up the phone and asking people and getting those sort of questions answered, but I always had that background of being attached to a newspaper, and I wasn't quite sure if when I was just like an author writing a book, if people would still be as willing to help. But it's amazing, and I think people always love talking about themselves and their experiences, and if you're sort of genuinely interested and hoping to portray it accurately, I think they're happy to help you.
I think you're right. We've had hundreds of authors sit here and say that, and many of them are writing about things where they have very limited or virtually no expertise, but they're always people willing to help them. It's an interesting point, though, you make about maybe as a journalist, people would be slightly more resistant because they might worry that they were going to wind up in a public eye or something, but if you're writing a book, maybe they feel like there's greater anonymity.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've sort of found people quite helpful in both instances, really. Yeah, and I think, I think the key is, both, sort of writing news articles, but also in the book is, I think just trying to have that attention to detail and really listen to what people are saying, and not just the content of what they're saying, but the spirit in which they're saying it, and really try and capture that kind of, what it means to them, and what it means to them to be someone who lives out, in this kind of area or have this kind of experience.
So you like to write stories with a fairly limited, in this classic sense, a fairly limited number of suspects. I mean, where this crime takes place, there are not a lot of people. So you have we've already said that, right? So you have a fairly small pool of potential suspects. We're pretty sure that he didn't just go out there and commit suicide by running around this document. I mean, that'd be an awful way to die. You shoot yourself or something before you would do that. So, what's the trick for you as a novelist, with a small cast to keep it going and to, cast your red herrings and clues about and all and make it interesting?
Yeah, I mean, I always enjoy kind of having quite a tight cast of characters. I think personally, because I find it a little bit easier as a writer to sort of have keep people sort of under control. So I know exactly what's going on, and also just as a reader as well. I mean, I think I hate it when you're reading those books where someone just sort of drops in at the last minute or it turns out to be sort of someone in a city that you've never really come across before. So I think it's really important to kind of it's a sort of fine line between surprising and tricking the readers. I think you always want to come down to the line of surprise, so for me, there's a few sort of things I sort of think about. I do tend to go for those more isolated settings where there's not sort of 100 people coming and going. There's for whatever reason a group of people who are there and they're staying there, and that's who we're sort of dealing with. So and I think Australia has so many opportunities for that as well. Like it's quite sort of it's quite fun to kind of just try and decide exactly where to set it.
So in your second book, in there was that classic thing about so many people went into the woods and one fewer came back, right? And that's a wonderful structure. Tana French's book In the Woods, Harlan Coben has written that. I mean, it's actually a Grimm's fairy tale kind of a thing, That was a different set of landscape and whatever that we've been talking about. What drew you to that?
Yeah, so in Force of Nature, it was set in again in a remote area, but this time in bushland, and it was in the winter.
Right.
And that was set in a sort of a fictional area just outside Melbourne, and it was a group of women who were on one of these dreaded corporate retreats, going on this terrible sort of hiking, team building exercise, and then not all of them come out at the end. And I think there was a few reasons why I chose that. One was partly because I was quite conscious that I didn't just want to write another book like The Dry. I was so delighted with The Dry and the response it got from readers, but I think it would have been a mistake to try and just replicate that. I think it's important to push yourself and explore new ideas. So I wanted to set it somewhere that was that was different but still recognisably Australian. So the kind of real dense bushland was a great option for that. And I sort of I really enjoyed kind of the characters that were involved, and I think the way that this group of women were very set in their hierarchy in their corporate environment, but then when you put people in an environment that's different, those structures start to fall apart, and suddenly it's not about who has the corner office and the salary. It's more about who's the fittest and who knows how to read a map, and all those different kind of skills start to come play, and it kind of fractures that quite firm structure.
Is there anything about The Lost Man you'd like to say that I haven't asked you or hasn't come up?
I think just I really loved writing this book. Like, it was so much fun, and I think the whole thing I just thoroughly enjoyed. I mean, from the research stage through to kind of exploring the new characters. Because I should actually mention this is a standalone. So the first two books, have the same recurring character in Aaron Falk, who's an investigator in Melbourne. But with this one being set in such an outback region, I just knew unless he was on some sort of like four-wheel drive holiday, it wasn't going to be the story for him. But I think it was really enjoyable for me to get to know like these new characters and sort of build them up from scratch, and I absolutely loved writing about them. I still think about them a lot. I mean, particularly Nathan, who's the main character, and sort of unpacking, I guess, the all the background that kind of makes him the man he is was really very interesting for me as a writer.
It's a book that you don't want a sequel to. You want it to end where it ends, and then you can imagine what their lives might be like, those still standing, when they're gone, which is the way I always felt about Gone with the Wind. I never really wanted to know what happened after she went back to Tara. And I've said this before, Rebecca ended when the house burned down, and all these tiresome things like Mrs. De Winter. Who wanted to know? That was not really the point. So Jane, your book has had a big international, your work, success. You won the Gold Dagger, the British Gold Dagger for The Dry. For those of you who don't know, that's the British Crime Writers Association's highest award. We have the Edgar in the United States. We have the Ned Kelly Award in Australia. And in Canada, we have the Arthur Ellis Award, which is really kind of gruesome because it's a little man hanging from a gibbet, because Arthur Ellis was the hangman of Canada. Who was Ned Kelly?
Who was Ned Kelly? So he was a bushranger, and he was actually quite a dangerous man who shot a policeman and was sort of notorious, and he was well known for having he had that, you've probably seen the images, but he sort of fashioned like a helmet out of a bucket, I think, and it had like a slit for the eyes, and it was that's sort of the image that, you see this kind of metal sort of front with the eyes visible. So he's sort of gone down in an Australian legend, but more sort of notorious than celebrated these days, I would say.
What does the award look like? The Edgar is a kind of peculiar bust of Edgar Allan Poe, and the dagger obviously is the dagger. But what's the Ned Kelly look like?
So it actually is his mask. So it's it's like a wood frame with like the kind of the metal, the metal sort of mask on it. So it's quite cool. It's a nice looking trophy.
So this is the first time you've toured the United States. You were popped over for the last book, but you haven't actually gone on book tour here. Is it different than, have you toured in the UK? Obviously you must have gone around in Australia. Do you find differences in going around the different countries and the reactions that you get?
So I've done quite a bit of touring in Australia, and this is the first time I've been over in the States doing events, which is really, really great to have the chance to do that. And I've been over in the UK a little bit for the Dry. I went to the Harrogate Crime Festival, which I'm not sure maybe some people may have been. That was really interesting. And it was just this sort of very just event full of enthusiasts. You know, like I mean, it's people come from miles around, and it's so well attended, and everybody kind of comes every year, and they all know each other and things. So it's a really sort of festive atmosphere. So I did that, and it's quite. I don't know, it's quite interesting. Sometimes you do get sort of slightly different takes on the book, you know, just based on, I mean, in Australia, they are a bit more familiar, I guess, with the settings and things. So, you know, there's, you know, people, I guess there's a bit of a shorthand in the discussion, and that you don't have to sort of go into things in the same way as you do sometimes when I'm giving interviews overseas, especially in Europe. And I mean, here, I mean, you guys know, like, heat and you know space and things, so I think there's a lot of similarities here as well.
Well, I hope it's going to be a wonderful, well, I hope it is at the moment a pleasurable experience, but I hope it will go on being one. I'm going to say goodbye to our video viewers right now, and thank you for joining us.